Deep in the Viennese woods, 2 gunshots rang through a hunting lodge. The cracks echoed through the estate, shaking chandeliers, rocking gold-plated picture frames and settling underneath peeling pink wallpaper. Perhaps the eyes of a deer mount close shut. Maybe the nuns that drift through the estate today can still hear the shots at night, piercing through stained glass, splitting mahogany pews. Austria-Hungary's Crown Prince Rudolf had travelled to the Mailing hunting lodge under the guise of a poaching party, a safe pretext for a man whose father once wrote that, quote, "the hunter is in Rudolf's blood." The quiet drive to Mailing, around 20 miles outside of Vienna's city centre, was the last trip that the Crown Prince would take alive, and by his side was the beautiful 17-year-old Baroness Mary Vestera. On the 30th of January 1889, locked inside a secluded room in the estate, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne pulled out a revolver and buried a bullet into the side of Mary's head. While the Baroness lay bleeding out against the scarlet-stained bed, Rudolf turned the handgun on his own temple, apparently holding up a quivering compact mirror to take aim. The once formidable Hapsburg family line had imploded in an instant, and attempts to rehabilitate the Austro-Hungarian bloodline would prove fatal for the entire world. This is Crown Undone. Crown Prince Rudolf of Austria was born in Schloss Luxembourg in August 1858. He was the eldest son and thought to be successor of Emperor Franz Joseph, who, as the grandson of Francis II, would have been in line to rule the vast swathes of land that made up the Holy Roman Empire, were it not for its near-total collapse under the weight of Napoleon's armies in 1806. Franz Joseph had been introduced to Rudolf's mother Elizabeth of Bavaria, or Sisi as she was known, at a meeting that had been arranged for the young emperor to formally propose to Sisi's elder sister, Helene. But as the Bavarian court was plunged into mourning when the sister's uncle died, the black grieving clothes apparently better suited Sisi's fairer complexion and clashed with Helene's darker features. The emperor could only find eyes for the 16-year-old Sisi, 7 years his junior. Franz Joseph confessed to his mother that if he couldn't propose to Sisi, he would never marry. The unforeseen pair were wed 8 months later at the Augustinian Church in Vienna in 1854. Before Rudolf was born, Sisi had been hounded by the court to produce a son and an heir. An anonymous pamphlet was left on her nightstand that read, "If the queen bears no sons, she is merely a foreigner in the state, and a very dangerous foreigner too." Rudolf was finally born on the 21st of August 1858, welcomed by a 101-gun salute that echoed throughout Vienna. Rudolf's education was initially entrusted to Count Leopold Gondrecourt, a decorated military serviceman who was ordered to toughen up the sensitive crown prince. Rudolf was awoken at night by sounds of pistols in his bedchamber. He was waterboarded, locked inside animal enclosures overnight, and forced to undergo hours and hours of extreme physical exercise, to the point that 2 years later Gondrecourt would be dismissed after Sisi was said to have discovered Rudolf training in deep Austrian snow before the sun had even risen. Despite Rudolf's later passion for learning and intellectualism, thanks to his next tutor, Joseph Latour von Thunberg, he was barred from receiving further education at university, lamenting, quote, "The lowest petty official has a larger sphere of influence than I am condemned to idleness." Once he finished his studies under von Thunberg in 1878, he was whisked off to Prague to serve in an infantry regiment. The Crown Prince would work his way through the ranks, becoming a colonel, major, field marshal, and then a general infantry inspector by 1888, only a few months before his death. But let's rewind first. As a young royal bachelor in 1880, the Austrian court decided to seek out a potential partner for Rudolf in the young monarchy of Belgium. Rudolf's prospective bride, Princess Stephanie, was the daughter of the incumbent King Leopold II, who, as an aside, facilitated unbelievably brutal atrocities in the Congo Free State during his own private rubber-making project. The forced labourers under Leopold's administration would have their hands cut off when they failed to produce enough rubber. The wedding day was eventually set for the 22-year-old Austrian crown prince and the 17-year-old Belgian princess. Rudolf's cousin, Countess Marie, remarked of Stephanie, quote, "We had pity on the poor princess who would have the honour of being chosen." Stephanie's one and only pregnancy was announced in the spring of 1883, 2 years after the wedding, and despite earnest hopes for a son and an heir to the throne, Stephanie gave birth to a girl on the 2nd of September. She was named Elizabeth. Rudolf grew more withdrawn from the court in the years following his daughter's birth. He started living for extended periods of time outside the capital, befriended anti-monarchists, started publishing his own political writings anonymously in national newspapers, and pursued even more extramarital affairs. Even the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, complained that there was nothing he could teach Rudolf about sexual matters. It's alleged that Rudolf may have sired upwards of 30 illegitimate children. By the beginning of 1886, Rudolf had fallen dangerously ill. Diagnoses of stomach disease and bladder infections aimed to steer attention away from the far more likely possibility of an STI after years of unprotected dalliances. The incredibly contagious infection probably spread to Stephanie too, who was likely rendered infertile at just 22, dashing the crown's hopes for an heir, let alone another child. Given the extreme range in symptoms of STIs, it may have been difficult for medical professionals to distinguish between the side effects of Rudolf's infection and more general depression. Either way, prescriptions of opium, morphine, and possibly mercury certainly wouldn't have helped Rudolf's psychological state. The medication probably worsened his mental anguish, and as he grew more isolated from court life, he spiraled into one of the most major and the last of his mental breakdowns. At around the same time, Rudolf asked whether one of his most regular lovers, Mitzi Caspar, would be interested in a suicide pact, because, as Rudolf admitted, it would be too lonely to die on his own. While it's been speculated that Rudolf saw Mitzi as his one true love, she never entertained the same fantasies that he did. Mitzi was probably the only one that expressed serious concern for Rudolf. That same year, Mitzi reported Rudolf's suicidal ideations to the Austrian chief of police, but her calls would fall on deaf ears. On the day that Rudolf met the young Baroness Mary Vestera in November 1888, Mary wrote in her diary that a passion was born when she locked eyes with him at the races. Mary's mother, Eleni, was the daughter of a top Armenian banker, and her father, Alban, belonged to a lesser branch of the Austrian nobility. Historian Joan Haslip called Mary, quote, a girl who wore too much jewelry and flirted with married men. She had been brought up with only one aim in view, to attract and to please men. Mary endured a strained relationship with her mother, eventually writing to a friend that, quote, Mama has no love for me. She has treated me like something she means to dispose of to the best advantage. At just 17, Mary was determined to see Rudolf again by enlisting the help of Rudolf's cousin, Countess Marie. Marie was the illegitimate daughter of Empress Sisi's brother, Ludwig Wilhelm, a Bavarian duke. With Marie acting as a go-between, Mary was whisked off to meet Rudolf in clandestine visits to his apartments at Hapsburg Palace. Mary wrote to a friend that Rudolf had implored her to come back as soon as possible, and the pair continued to secretly meet up. Their encounter on the 13th of January of the following year, likely the day they consummated their affair, meant so much to Mary that she purchased a cigarette case with, quote, 13th of January thanks to fate engraved onto it, and even told her sister to visit her grave on the very date each year with flowers. Mary wrote to a friend that she finally, quote, became a woman, and that she and the Crown Prince now, quote, belong to each other in body and soul. On the same date, Rudolf also commemorated the occasion with an iron ring tied to a delicate silver chain. The letters standing for the German phrase "in love, united until death" were engraved onto the tiny ring's interior. A few days later, Rudolf would invite two of his friends, Prince Philip of Coburg and Count Joseph Hoyos, on a trip to his hunting lodge in Mayerling. It was agreed that the three would meet sometime in the next week. No one except Rudolf could have known it would be his last. On the 28th of January, Mary Vestera was secretly transported to Hapsburg Palace and then smuggled into a car with one of Rudolf's drivers, Joseph Bratfish, to meet the Crown Prince at a nearby hotel before their final trip towards Mayerling. The next morning, Prince Philip and Count Hoyos arrived at the hunting lodge at around 8 a.m. Rudolf received them as usual, explained he had likely come down with a cold on the drive from Vienna, and excused himself from the day's planned hunting. Not thinking much of it, Philip and Hoyos went without him. What Rudolf didn't explain was that the 17-year-old Mary Vestera was sharing the estate, albeit in a locked room, isolated and already ready to haunt the apartments. Prince Philip had to attend a state dinner in Vienna later that day, so decided to return from hunting earlier than Hoyos to join Rudolf for lunch. While the Crown Prince had been also expected to return to Vienna for the same state dinner, he said he wouldn't be able to on account of his cold, which he complained had worsened. Promising to make all of the appropriate excuses for Rudolf's absence to the Emperor, Prince Philip mounted his horse and began the ride back into the city. Just Rudolf and Hoyos would dine together that night. Hoyos later recalled that the dinner was a very simple meal consisting of soup, goose liver pie, roast beef, venison, and pastry. Before leaving for the evening to tend to his cold, Rudolf got up from the mahogany table and told Hoyos that he would see him at breakfast the next morning. Once Hoyos had retired to bed, Rudolf collected Mary, and the two were entertained by Bratfish, their driver. The lovers exchanged gifts with the driver, and Mary apparently told him that this would be the last time they'd see each other. Maybe Bratfish didn't catch the young Baroness's ominous words, or maybe he had just hoped that he had had misheard. Rudolf got their room ready and ordered his valet Johann Loschek, who had been appointed as Rudolf's hallkeeper, to not disturb him, no matter the circumstances. "Don't let anybody come in," he said with a slight shake in his voice, "even if it is the emperor." The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne pulled the door shut, locked it, and both Mary and Rudolf took a seat beside each other at the room's desk to pen their final goodbyes, using mailing stationery to sign their names at the page's end. To Stephanie, Rudolf wrote, quote, "You are relieved of my presence and vexations. Be happy in your own way. Be kind to the poor little one, who is all that remains of me." Listening to the scratches of Rudolf's pen, the 17-year-old Mary wrote to her mother, quote, "Forgive me for what I have done. I could not resist my love." And to her sister, she wrote, quote, "We are both going blissfully into the uncertain beyond." Loschek stayed in the apartments adjoining Rudolf and Mary's room. It was late by the time they all went to bed, and the valet said he could hear the pair speaking late into the night. The Crown Prince passionately kissed his teenage mistress. He stroked her hair, her chin, brushed his fingers down the side of her face, took one step back, and shot her through the head. Rudolf paced the room for hours, working up the courage to honour his side of the deal. Mary had been an opportunity, one that meant Rudolf could go down on his own terms without the complete loneliness. The valet Loschek, in his official report, said that, quote, "At 6:10 in the morning, Rudolf came into my room fully dressed and ordered me to leave to get his carriage ready." Loschek said he couldn't even get to the lodge's outdoor courtyard before 2 gunshots went off behind him. The valet sprinted back towards the room, pulled on the door handle, and found that the door was locked from the inside. Count Hoyos, who stayed the night at the workman's cottage on the estate, was walking towards the main dining room to eat breakfast with Rudolf, as he had been promised the evening before. But before he could take a seat, Loschek ran into the room exclaiming that Rudolf's door was locked and that the Crown Prince would not answer. Hoyos didn't seem to feel the same fear as Loschek. "He's probably sleeping very well and soundly," he replied. "Leave him be." That was until Loschek explained that the Crown Prince had been awake, in full regalia, only an hour before. The two returned to the room, more worried this time, armed with a hammer, which Hoyos used to strike against the locked door. When there was still no response, Hoyos asked whether Rudolf may have suffocated from the heating fumes. By this time, Prince Philip had returned to Meiling from his state dinner at Vienna. On seeing the two others contemplating their next move outside the entrance to Rudolf's apartments, Philip suggested they hammer down the door. Loschek would go in while the others waited outside. The valet struck one of the door's panels and was finally able to reach his hand beyond the precipice and unlock the door from the inside. The room was unbearably quiet. Loschek took 2 echoing footsteps beyond the doorway and saw Crown Prince Rudolf fully dressed and leaning over the side of his bed, bleeding from his mouth. Rudolf had blown his skull to pieces with the revolver that now lay by his side. The 17-year-old Mary Vestera lay on her own bed, the blood on her temple already congealed. Rigor mortis had set in. Rudolf had sat with her lifeless body for hours before he turned the revolver on himself. Visible from where the valet was standing was a folded note in Rudolf's hand addressed to Loschek himself. It read, quote, "Get a clergyman and bury us in a shared grave." Loschek knew immediately that the Crown Prince's last wish would never happen. Once Loschek left the bloodied room and alerted the others, it was decided that Count Hoyos would travel back to Vienna to tell the Emperor Franz Joseph. While on the journey, Loschek telegraphed the Habsburgs' official physician and then hid Mary's corpse, deciding it would be too much of a liability. Hoyos got to Hofburg Palace at 10 a.m. but was only able to find Empress Sisi, who had just finished one of her workout regimes in the gymnasium. Hoyos was beside himself. "It was dreadful to see her so unprepared," Hoyos reported later. "I cannot tell you how he broke the news to her, but I found the strength to say, 'You must tell the Emperor, your Majesty. You alone can.'" Sisi only had the heart to tell her husband that Mary had fatally poisoned Rudolf and the two were now dead. By 12:30 that same afternoon, a post-mortem was carried out on Rudolf's bloodied body. It was concluded that the Crown Prince had committed suicide as a result of morbid nervous exhaustion. He couldn't have realised what he was doing. Any excuse for a dispensation from the Vatican that would allow Rudolf a proper funeral and burial in the imperial crypt. In the evening, Rudolf's corpse was finally moved from Meiling to Vienna under strict secrecy. The quest to conceal what the Crown Prince had managed to do was underway. No one should know what happened. The royal family destroyed the majority of letters and documents, demanded silence from witnesses, and by the 31st of January, newspapers circulated the lie that the, quote, "illustrious Crown Prince had breathed his last breath as the result of a stroke." Some other reports referred to a sudden heart attack. Mary's involvement was kept out of every official report. As far as they were concerned, she was not there. She had never existed. Mary's corpse was transported from the hunting lodge into the back of a carriage between 2 of her uncles. She was propped up with a broomstick, dressed as if alive, and taken to a village cemetery in the southern part of the Vienna woods. Mary was buried on her own on the 1st of February. By May, her family had located the grave and reburied the girl in a copper coffin. Mary's remains have been exhumed twice since 1889. She's never been allowed to rest. Crown Prince Rudolf was allowed the Roman Catholic burial demanded of a king in the imperial crypt. It was a small and private affair. Foreign royalty weren't allowed, aside from Princess Stephanie's parents who insisted that they come. Neither Cece nor Stephanie attended the funeral, and just 6 people were allowed to accompany Franz Joseph into the crypt. The Austro-Hungarian emperor was never one to cry. He resented Rudolf's sensitivity, his intelligence and liberalism, but deep in the crypt, gazing at his son's fractured skull held together with white bandage, the emperor fell to his knees and wept. Rudolf's name was no longer allowed to be uttered in court. Franz Joseph had the Mailing Hunting Lodge converted into a convent for the nuns of the Discalced Carmelite order, who might still hear the gunshots at night. The once formidable Habsburg family line had imploded in an instant, and the fate of Rudolf's successor, Franz Ferdinand, would prove fatal for the entire world. This was Crown Undone.